What's going on, beautiful people? Welcome to the first J4 conversation edition for the new year. I've been on hiatus since November was my last posting. Just kind of got away from me, y'all. Had a lot going on, a lot of positive things in the familia, graduation ceremonies, marriages, vacation, all those kind of things. So I was a little remiss in my YouTube responsibilities, but I just had to take a break. Um, they say December is actually a great time for YouTubers because, you have people who are at home and outside of the work routine. And in order to sort of kill time, they kind of go to the YouTube streets. So for those of you who are in there, I hope that you grew. I hope that you got more energy and excitement around your page. But as for me, I had to shut it down, y'all. I took a trip to Puerto Rico, y'all. For those of you all who want to have an immersed, at least aesthetic, an appearing country of biracial folks, you have to take a trip to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico obviously is a combination of indigenous folks, folks who are already there, from some form of Spanish colonization and a dominant African presence. But while it appeared to be aesthetically, at least from the wonderful hospitality, the people, the language, the food, the architecture, the sort of Spanish aesthetic coupled with the U.S. aesthetic. Puerto Rico was a beautiful, beautiful place, man. And with the exception of the language, clearly Spanish predominantly, aesthetically, man, it looked like you were looking at cousins, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews. So if you want to have something to shake up what might be your experience here in the United States, where even with the exception of heavily dense black urban centers, you find yourself in minorities. Certainly, if you're biracial identifying and that's cognitive or top of mind, you'll find yourself obviously aware that you are not numerically represented in high numbers. But if you go to Puerto Rico, you will not have that, and that's important. As a biracial kid, to at least be immersed in a country, not in a country, but in a in the United States essentially, but to be immersed in an island where you have a strong presence from African folk, definitely strong presence from Puerto Rico folks. You don't feel this white dominance because there are not that many of them, and there's just this acceptance that's unspoken across. I'm sure there's colorization, but you certainly didn't feel it. I didn't feel it, and it was just kind of a sense of at least home, a sort of a sentiment of home when I was in Puerto Rico. We blended right in. People were speaking Spanish to us initially, and then we had to reveal our lack of fluidity in Spanish. But we were embraced, and certainly the way we were treated, folks felt as if we were Puerto Ricans, or to say it differently, we presented as such. And that's a very interesting thing, to where you're so numerically represented, it almost becomes a homogeneity and a non-issue. But the Puerto Rican brothers, they got the fades. You can certainly see the tight coat, the hair texture in the women as well. Voluptuous, beautiful looking women, and it's just an interesting feeling. And so, if you perpetually are cognizant or aware of your small representation in your respective community, state, city, whatever the case may be, consider a trip to Puerto Rico just to walk among folks who sort of resemble you in unique kind of ways. Special shout out to Tonell Breaker. How you doing, brother? I don't know if y'all been to Puerto Rico. Let me know. Let me know what your experiences were. Mulatto Vanguard, good to see you. But not only did I take a vacation, man, it was a beautiful family trip. Again, a lot to celebrate. In my personal family, some graduations. My wife picked up another degree. Two of my sons graduated, and it was a time for good celebration. So in lieu of the Christmas gifts and those kind of things, we decided to spoil ourselves on a vacation. But as soon as I got back, I had to hit the road and go to Las Vegas, Nevada, because my oldest daughter was getting married. Yep. So I got my first child got married, and so we were out there for the ceremony and, of course, the festivities, the family, the fellowship, to watch her and her gentleman friend, a cat out of Puerto Rico, not Puerto Rico, but New Orleans by way of Georgia. They got married, and they've been together 8 years, so it wasn't new, but they decided to tie that knot for both love and practical reasons as well. So shout out to baby girl. And then, of course, just the rhythm of the semester, everything getting started. So thank you guys for reaching out to me. A couple of y'all reached out to me and said, where you been, man? What you doing? And I had to take that as motivation. Mulatto Vanguard, I appreciate that. Magic Mulatto, reached out. And that's an element of the community, right? The community sort of reaching out, said, hey, haven't heard from you, checking in, where you at, how you been, and what's going on. So thank you guys for that. So I'm kind of back. I don't know what the regularity of it'll be. Sometimes I struggle, with content like all of us. But today is January 15th. Today is January 15th, a seminal date in America's history, as well as Black specific cultural history, but also, I dare say, to biracial history. And our question today is, do biracials owe Dr. King? Do biracials owe Dr. King? And if so, what do they owe? And we can get into that. I'll drop the link down up the road. Appreciate the congratulations there. The Dr. King was born on January 15th, 1929, y'all. He's a seminal figure. And in fact, for biracial kids, when you're looking initially in identity formation, as in my case, biracial by birth, but Black identifying, but certainly here more recently, a hyper curiosity about biracial identity formation and development of culture and community. But when I was looking in a very concentrated, asserted kind of way as to understand who I was culturally, naturally we look out to biography, or we look at the seminal historical figures that represent a powerful, an empowerment, a self-reliant, a self-determination, a sense of agency managed through the Black lens and Black space. And a couple of figures will stand out. Most practically for my era was Malcolm X El Haj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm Little initially before his conversion into the Nation of Islam. And then the other figure was Dr. King. Dr. King more prominently than Malcolm and others because Dr. King was sort of the seminal figure of Black history, particularly through civil rights, that was presented in K-12 platforms. Dr. King, up to a certain stage of his existence, was very palatable in sort of revisionist history in terms of a figure to put out there for Black History Month and to tell a little bit about Black story, Black narrative, Black presence, Black resiliency, and a journey into what contemporary America is that goes symbolically through King of 1950s and 1960. And so he had a certain palatableness, this I have a dream stoic presentation of Dr. King that we often lock in, knowing that he's much more than that. People tend to think that, when you think of Dr. King, that he was born full grown. And the first words out of his mouth was the 1963 I have a dream speech, right? That's a little bit of tongue in cheek, but the way he's packaged and the way propaganda is built around Dr. King, you tend to see him exclusively as that 15 or so minute speech in front of the Capitol in April of 1963, I think it was. However, Dr. King is much more complex than that. I want to kind of get into that. I want to talk about Dr. King as teeing up the biracial modern era. But I do want to know, from those who are in here, and I appreciate y'all, do biracials owe Dr. King anything? Do they owe Dr. King anything? And I know that's a bit vague, but what do you think? Yes, no? And while you guys are typing in, given that today is his birthday, and communities of people are celebrating it in different kind of ways. Tomorrow's a day off for many different folks. It's important that you know a bit about Dr. King. He's more than just I have a dream and then April 4th, 1968 assassinated. Dr. King did some things. Dr. King did some things that literally changed the trajectory of America, that constantly put on the mind of the American lexicon and conversation the Constitution and its application successfully and or failurely in a modern era, speaking of the mid-60s, the civil rights era. He literally changed, and through his work and through his representation of countless young people, countless women, countless men across multiple races, but predominantly within Black spaces, he changed the way America is today. You cannot tell a modern story with regards to race and identity and state of existence without including, perhaps in the highest level of chapters, Dr. King's work. I believe that. And I believe that as someone who considers Dr. King an historical mentor. In my own coming of age process, I studied Dr. King. I studied Malcolm. I studied a number of other biographies that were talking about Black uplift. I was looking for example. I was looking for heroes and sheroes that I could align a sense of pride to. As I was navigating localized cultural spaces, I needed something bigger. I needed something more large, something more profound to find my sense of esteem. And Dr. King provided that for me. And there's a few reasons why. For one, Dr. King was a thinker. You know, Dr. King is often there is an element of plagiarism that's associated with Dr. King, and I think that's been proven. But Dr. King was not necessarily a creator of original thought. That wasn't his forte per se. Dr. King was an individual who just consumed information, consumed text, consumed some of the brightest and most pronounced thinkers. And he would take what he was learning, and he had this beautiful capacity to apply it to a modern time, whether it was ancient Greek texts, whether it was Semitic writings, whether it was philosophers, philosophy, whether it was writers of the 15th century, the 17th century, certainly in the modern era. And he could extrapolate themes and values and lessons and apply them to a modern era. Dr. King was a profound thinker. In fact, Dr. King was so ahead intellectually that he skipped a few grades and never graduated from high school. Dr. King never graduated from high school because in 1944, as GIs were being sent off to the war, Morehouse College, a black men's college at the time, was suffering from an enrollment crisis, and so he had so the school sent out a call to if anyone could pass the admissions test, even if they hadn't completed high school, could successfully gain admission into Morehouse. Dr. King took that test at 15 years old, passed it, and then began his academic journey at Morehouse in 1944, I believe. All right, let's see. Toenail Berg, to be honest, I can't comment on it because where I was born and raised, MLK had no influence politically and socially other than being a USA Black figure. Beautiful. Certainly understand that. But as I walk down the road, maybe you can offer your perspective and or opinion. So Dr. King, a young cat in Alabama. He was born in Atlanta. Born in Atlanta. He was born to essentially religious royalty. His grandfather was a preacher of well-renowned in Atlanta. His father was a preacher in Atlanta. And Dr. King initially wasn't drawn to the ministry. He had sort of a resistance to it. He thought it was too emotional, that it was too fiery. Dr. King was more logical, more intellectual. And as you can see in his sermons, they definitely have elements of high intellectualism, but spoken in a language and rhetoric that spoke to the people at a very particular time, and not just for feel good or sort of redemption in post-death, but used religion and religiosity essentially to address a current problem, to address an immediate problem. And the problem that was most dominant on Dr. King's mind was that of segregation, or more succinctly, to end segregation, a very bold thing. But for a 15-year-old started at Morehouse, that is the gall by which he approached his education and his learning, even though he was sort of still immature compared to other 18, 19-year-olds who were starting. And he didn't necessarily do that well academically at Morehouse. He had 1A. He was in a class called Bible. But his writings, folks who were observing him, they definitely saw something in him. Initially, he was drawn to, he wanted to be a lawyer or a medical doctor, but he realized early in his undergrad degree that he didn't have an aptitude for science and math. And so there went law and there went medical school. And then eventually he was looking, I believe, strategically to say, what means by way of a profession can I have the most relevancy on addressing civil rights? And he felt that that would be the pulpit. He felt that he had already the cachet and sense of breadth in his family name. He had already had sort of a reputation that he would inherit, sort of his father's and grandfather's work. and that he could accelerate his path towards relevancy in addressing civil rights and addressing segregation there, primarily in the South, although his work expands beyond the South in the mid part of the 60s. So Dr. King is committed to resolving segregation. Segregation, for some of y'all listening in, was a legal construct largely in the South, but had application in the North as well, of which, based upon color, and you all know this from the one drop rule, if you had any sense of color, that you existed in two Americas. And segregation was justified that those two experiences had relative equalness, but we know through lived and examined reality, that's not the case. And so segregation means to separate. And you separate schools, separate public accommodations, and things where it didn't make sense for separation. You then had sitting in front of the bus, sitting in back of the bus, having to get your food in the back or from a counter, but you couldn't go to the movies, or you had to be in the balcony if you were a person of color. And America lived in this reality following Reconstruction of 1877, up until the mid 60s, where some teeth within the 14th Amendment was applied, and the nation then turned a corner. Dr. King was a seminal figure in that. He graduated from Morehouse College. He gets a letter of recommendation to attend seminary Crozer School in Philadelphia. He then gets tuned in and turned on to his intellectual self, and he becomes a scholar of the highest regard. He quickly graduates with another bachelor's degree in theology from Crozer, graduates valedictorian, top of his class, and then receives a scholarship to attend to pursue his PhD work, which he does at Boston University. He finishes at Boston. He's roughly 26 years old, and now he has to make a decision. All of his writing, all of his thinking, all of his organization was built around addressing segregation and strategizing. There are two seminal figures. In Dr. King's life. There's three seminal figures in Dr. King's writings and readings that he calls upon to construct what will ultimately become the plan of action that is implemented in the mid-50s through the Montgomery Improvement Association. There were three seminal figures. What do y'all think those three figures were? Appreciate y'all riding with me. What do y'all think those three seminal figures were? Trying to get a little participation here on Dr. King's birthday. The first one was Gandhi, the Mahatma, and in part because Gandhi had successfully implemented a strategy that ultimately resulted in India achieving independence from Britain. And that was nonviolence, some form of nonviolence. King saw people who were numerically at mass, larger, but were under a colonial regime, rulership, and how could they have a transition that was not violent, that was not destroying the country, nor did it have to evoke the imperialistic power of a colonial presence. So they came up with the strategy of nonviolence, and I'm sure Gandhi got that from somewhere else. But you see that evoked in the letter from Birmingham jail, where King is essentially outlining what nonviolence is to his clergymen counterparts as a way of calling for urgent action and not silent observation from the sidelines. He called upon them to get in the game, to get in the fight, that the time was not now, that the time is always right to do right, and that time was now. And so Dr. King evokes and articulates nonviolence, re-articulated for relevancy in the mid-60s, but he evokes that from the strategy under the leadership of the Mahatma in India. So that was a seminal strategist for Dr. King. The other one that I think comes probably after the seminal mentor for Dr. King was Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a Jewish philosopher, I believe, in Germany, and he comes up with this concept called I thou versus I it. He introduces this philosophical concept called I thou versus I it. Okay. And I'm leading to the question of, do biracials owe Dr. King? And this is a seminal part of it here. But he's the articulation of the philosophy of I thou versus I it was essentially a we versus you orientation to the world, a worldview. I thou has interconnectedness. I, the self, is present, thou, the you, is present, and that we have a sort of a co-independent, a codependency upon each other for whatever the outcome might be. That the destination is thought, the people in the destination are all thought of, the individual and the group, the individual and the we, the individual and the us. That this is a worldview that if you accept it, you own it, you embrace it, it becomes your dogma, whatever the case may be. You'll move through the world mindful of decisions that you make because you're concerned about the outcomes upon people. Upon people. Now, I don't know Martin Buber's central orientation. Was he talking about that from a Semitic, Jewish, German kind of dynamic, right? But Dr. King takes this concept of I, thou, us versus I, it, meaning you don't see other people as legitimately grounded, solid, profound, complex beings born from a mother's womb. You see them as objects, I, it, that you have a self-centered orientation of the world and you move about not concerned about how groups evolve. You're concerned about how you can manipulate groups to your own benefit and gain. That is an I, it relationship to the world. Central to this is the objectification of other human beings, that they're simply tools towards your treasure, right? That's one way of being in the world. Now, I think he's drawn to this because his ultimate mentor, before I introduce him, check this out. Thunder King, famous speech was given in Detroit before the DC speech. Yep. Dr. King, because of modern technology, it's difficult to repeat speeches. But when you have localized press and not necessarily national press, Detroit is probably a local piece. DC was certainly macro. It's the one we know of most. But King would deliver speeches and extrapolate and test and have use similar framing and ideal concepts wherever he would go. So in this case, Thunder was on the father's shoulders for both. That's powerful, boy. That's powerful. I was alive when Dr. King was alive, but obviously I didn't engage him. I wanted to be a part of the movement, y'all. I wanted to, but my mother thought having to change my diapers every few minutes in the march would be problematic, so I had to hold back, y'all. I had to do my part. People should know, though, King came to Detroit to get counsel from Detroit leaders before his DC speech. He sought C.L. Franklin's counsel as well as other business and civic leaders in Detroit. I didn't know that. There's so much we don't know about the complexity, the struggle of Dr. King. He was jailed, over 10 times. He suffered bouts of depression. He was obsessed with his own death. He predicted it. His home was bombed twice. He had to manage threats of being accused of being communist. There was an outright assault and attack on Dr. King in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to essentially derail their movement, right? And thankfully they weren't successful in that. But what we are dealing with today, the kind of life and law we have today, how that law is enforced and regulated, and the outcomes and impact upon human beings today can be tied back to a period of which Dr. King was a seminal figure. And so our lived and sort of generalized and assumed reality today is directly attributed to the peril of a seminal figure in Dr. King. All right. Thunder's in here. I know the family that funded C.L. Franklin's church. He came to Detroit because Detroit was already making strides in civil rights before the other places in the country. So let me kind of spin off that, and I appreciate that. C.L. Franklin is Aretha Franklin's father. Speak on it. All right. Everybody, I hope you're doing good. If you're finding this informative and knowledgeable, show some love in the chat. I appreciate it. Do biracials owe Dr. King? Can y'all hear me? It sound like it went out. Let me know if y'all can hear me. It went out in my head. My volume went down, I think it was. All right. So the third mentor for Dr. King was uh, the Christ figure. The Christ figure. Dr. King was a theologian, a preacher, a minister, whatever you want to call him, but there's all different kinds of focal points. It's like law. You go to law school and then you focus on corporate. You focus on nonprofit. You focus on sport and entertainment. You focus on prosecution, criminal, whatever the case may be. Pastors have the same type of dynamic. They'll have a base of the seminary would teach them a base level of information, right? And then then they'll specify, right? And so Dr. King took his formal education and focused and concentrated on the love ethic of the Christ figure or Jesus Christ. That was his cosmic mentor. And he studied the life of Dr. King as an example, both in word, confession, testimony, and life lived, as a way to pull upon the familiarity of the populace, the Christianity of the populace, to remind them of their contradictions to their own historical deity or prophet or whatever the case may be. It was a masterful move. It was a masterful move. King used two things to remind America you're not living up to what you said. What you said. That was the Constitution, and that was the Christ paradigm, the Christ value set, largely manifested and represented in the love ethic of the Christ figure, Jesus. King pulled upon that cosmic mentor to anchor his approach to addressing segregation, i.e., civil rights. He touched upon the morality, the ideology, the God, the cosmics of the people. He touched upon their legal document, the Constitution, and then he touched upon their God as a way of saying, hey, you're not doing what you said you were going to do, and you're not walking in the pattern of your Christ figure anchored in your Christianity. Oh, man. Oh, man. Y'all all right? Woo. So to the point of King being an individual that looks about at other successes, in the case of Detroit, King also has a story of success in the space of civil rights at a localized level in terms of where he chooses to go to take on his first pastorship. He decides to, he could have went and become a professor. He could have certainly went and become a corporate figure, but he decides that he's going to continue in the ministry. And his first assignment that he accepts is in Montgomery, Alabama, in a church called Dexter Baptist Church. It is a church in a segregated neighborhood in a pretty affluent kind of community, and folks are ready to embrace a young PhD, excuse me, recently married to Coretta Scott, and he comes to Dexter Baptist Church, and he's in town for about a year. Now he joins a community, and there's already activists, there's already people there who are doing work, people who are about change and progress, localized there in Montgomery, Alabama. One of these figures is Miss Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, as you all know, is identified as the mother of the movement, and she, the story is very quickly told. She's not the first, but she is the one that they decided to build a test case around to challenge segregation in a public accommodation, which is a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She refuses to give up her seat. She's arrested, and the NAACP says we might have in the character of Rosa Parks where she can be unquestioned. She cannot be derailed by a poor reputation. She's an outstanding citizen, works for the city, and is married to a prominent figure in the community. She's secretary of the NAACP, excuse me, NAACP. I'm getting mixed up with my sports here. And they decide that they have a case. And so we have to start to organize. And so they call a meeting at Ralph Abernathy's church. Dr. King is present. And they say, we need to create an organization to manage a bus boycott. They do this at the church, but they have to pick a president. They have to pick a leader. And so they decide to pick Dr. King. They decided to pick Dr. King for two reasons. One, he's sharp. One, he hasn't made any enemies in localized Baptist politics. He's got a PhD. He too meets the bill. He can move a crowd, but also in sort of old school philosophy, if for some reason this thing fails, well, they can always blame that young fella, right? So nonetheless, Dr. King has about 20 minutes because they're gonna meet with the masses in about an hour. He lives about 20 minutes away, so he drives 20 minutes home. He gets himself together, changes his clothes, and he comes back 20 minutes later. It's an hour. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't write a speech. He didn't pull from another speech. He simply walked up to the microphone and spoke from his heart, spoke from his passion, spoke from his mind, spoke from who he was, and he delivered a speech that hit the right tone where it had enough militancy in it to mobilize the people, while at the same time enough compassion and purpose rooted in a love ethic Jesus to keep it in a religious center, to keep it essentially nonviolent. And so they send out pamphlets, they get the word out, and then he wakes up the next day and he and Coretta look outside his house where there's a bus route, and they literally see no or very few Black people on the bus. And they know that the first day has been sort of ceremoniously successful. They're elated, but then they realize that, hey, in order for this thing to get to the Supreme Court, we have to be able to do this for the long haul. And that community in Montgomery, Alabama, simply refusing to pay to be in segregated spaces. And when people wanted to get on that bus because they were tired and weary, the conversations, the car pool efforts, the walking that was occurring, regardless of age, that came from Montgomery, Alabama Black community. And they held that boycott despite trials, tribulations, challenges, threats, tickets, tires being popped and all that kind of stuff, going to jail, being harassed, bombing of homes. Despite the counter movement, they held on to it for almost a year. By that time, it had hit the the U.S. Supreme Court, and they passed the law that says segregation in public accommodations was illegal in Montgomery, Alabama. And because it was a Supreme Court case, it then applied to all things federal, which meant the United States of America. Dr. King was not the only person, but he was president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which led that campaign to end segregation in public accommodations, i.e. the buses. This was mid 1950s, 1955 or so. However, Dr. King and others, we don't have desegregation in mid-60s, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. It's not until the 1964 civil rights legislation where President Lyndon Baines Johnson assigns an executive order that enforces the implementation of the 14th Amendment. Just because you have segregation ending in Montgomery does not mean that it ends in Jacksonville, that it ends in Florida, that it ends in Mississippi, that it ends in Louisiana, that it ends in Texas. No, that was a very localized success story that became a test case that countless individuals then used to test. They tested through freedom rides, folks of all different kind of denominations, hues, races, gender, testing these new interstate kinds of transportation rules through buses. They got on them. They got their butts whooped. They suffered threat. They were pulled off buses, violence, all kinds of things were still going on in this. This was a very tumultuous time where it was very rigidly black-white, very rigidly black-white. And however, you have this young pastor out of Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. King, who has strategy that he learns from the Mahatma Gandhi, who has a philosopher that talks about the beauty and the critical importance of interconnectedness between human beings, regardless of race, religion, creed. And you see this manifest in his rhetoric and his speeches. And then he's anchoring all of this in perhaps the most known figure throughout earth at the time in the Christ figure. And he introduces his love ethic to challenge local protest, but also to speak to executive power in the president, in the Senate, in the Congress. And eventually Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Southern kid himself, decides that I'm going to lose the Southern vote, but I'm going to try to keep the country united as much as we can. And so the civil rights campaign manifested through countless acts, a Supreme Court case, lots of public attention, lots of strategy, lots of organizing, eventually gets signed in 1964 by Lyndon Baines Johnson. But it comes from activists on the ground, black activists in mass, a few, not a few, but a good percentage of folks who are there because of religious conviction, but also people who are just there because they know the time has come and it is the right thing to do. But one can undeniably have to attribute much of this work to the seminal representation figure, and that is Dr. King. How does this address the question, do biracials owe Dr. King? Y'all with me so far? Let's check in. Give me a why, give me an energy, give me some something. What's up, Duke? How you doing, brother? I think you're talking. You said something here. It's been a minute, man. Yes, everyone mixed with Afro-American has freedom thanks to Dr. King. Okay. Now let's keep that a little bit more specific. What does the civil rights legislation represent? Well, it enforces for the Voting Rights Act, it eliminates literacy laws for the most part, meaning where you had to do extra in order to vote, and it was in these extra things that negatively impacted people of color's ability to pass these tests so that they can vote. So it eliminates that. It then also introduces, it outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin in hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, and all other public accommodations engaged in interstate commerce, meaning it takes and reinforces and doubles down on what the U.S. Supreme Court said relating to the Montgomery case, and it puts the executive order that if you do not desegregate, you can no longer have federal dollars. So it's talking that money talk. And magically, when people are, when their profit and their money's involved, their morality or their so-called stand on social issues can easily become flexible because they're trying to preserve, protect, and maintain or gain as much money as possible. And so the Civil Rights Act put teeth in it, and it threatened state level leadership, political and otherwise, to get on with the program, the 14th Amendment, the Constitution, and no longer segregate in public kind of accommodation spaces. The other place is that it did the same thing in desegregation of public education and public facilities. And so how do biracials owe Dr. King? Well, I have to ask you, beautiful family, how did your mother and father meet? How did your mama and your daddy meet? Biracials have been around since different people have interacted. People of mixture have been around since human beings who share different phenotypes and different varying levels of melanin, biracial, mulatto, mixed people have been around since the first human beings interact. That's just something about the curiosity. However, in the United States of America, that was highly regulated. It was highly taboo. And for two people who loved each other of different races pre-1960, pre-1970, that was not only an act of love, but that was also an act of courage. That was also an act of courage among unknown threat to themselves personally, but they had observed threat to Black bodies consistently. To know the reality of vicious racist segregation and to then still pursue and enter into a love that is interracial is a high act of courage at that particular time when Dr. King and others were about their work. I am absolutely sure there were other interracial engagements, perhaps in secrecy, perhaps, in the darkness, right? Perhaps there was other interracial curiosities that blossomed into love, but they both at some points asked the question, are we willing to live a life? Because they don't know what America is going to look like in 2023. They have no clue. They just can assume there's going to be this constant navigation of threat and space and life and looks, and the children questions come up and family questions come up. I am sure There were folks who loved someone of another race and just said, no, I'm not going to subject myself to that despite the fact that I might love you. It was high courage to do something like that in the 60s when my parents got married, or even in the early 70s. No one saw what the integration experiment was going to look like. The reason biracials owe Dr. King, and King is representing something in mass here, is because King set America on a pathway via the civil rights legislation, via the enforcement of the executive order, to create opportunities of proximity for people who historically lived in rigid, segregated communities. I don't know what my volume keeps going down. Y'all feel me on this? This is not a leap, y'all. This is not a leap. Pre 1960, heavy segregation in living accommodations, neighborhoods, cities, heavy segregation in any social sector circles where you would meet people, to include school, to include sport, to include work, or certainly there was hierarchy, but anything that involved people coming together in public spaces was segregated. The civil rights legislation allowed for a different kind of proximity where people who historically did not interact with each other casually nor socially now find themselves in proximity to each other. How did your parents meet? In the case of my dad, military guy meets a French European woman in France in a social space. How did your parents meet, especially in the modern era? If you're 25, if you're 30 and biracial, how did your parents meet? And then to implicitly rewind the question, would your parents have met? Could that same story be told in 1950? The coming together of your parents, which produces your biracial mulatto self, could that same story be told in 1960? Could it be told in 1965, 1968? The civil rights legislation, symbolically represented through Dr. King, created legislation that allowed for America to get out of rigid segregation and to ensue and begin to have proximity towards each other. Duke says, I'm different. I'm from a mulatto Dominican and a white passing MGM. But your parents, if they were in the United States of America at that time, I don't know how old you are, or hence when your parents met, but the circumstances post civil rights for people of different racial backgrounds to come together and not have to make a courageous decision, but to make a decision that incrementally is just simply based upon attraction and love. The rigid raciality of the 60s is not as present nor dominant, rightfully and thankfully so, in the modern era. And that is because of legislation symbolically represented in the iconic figure of Dr. King. You have proximity to each other. One of the most seminal acts was the Higher Education Act that came on the backs of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was signed in 1965. It introduces financial aid. Now, all of a sudden, college is affordable. Prior to financial aid, loans, and particularly 5 years later, Pell Grants come into the picture. You could go to college if you had the academic acumen to be successful in it. Now you can go to college and you had support, you had a benefactor, you had scholarship where you were able to pay for it. But you see the diversification of higher education because now there's a means by which you can afford college, even though it's in a loan kind of situation. And you begin to see the diversification of higher education, which is in the age set of 18 to 22 for the most part. And that's when young people are curious about each other. They're out in these streets, their hormones are doing what they do. People meet each other, and you only engage people that you can have access to. Prior to the mid 60s, that was segregated. Post 1960s and then on incrementally becomes more and more diverse. The more diversity you have, the more curiosity people engaging, and then they begin to date each other. Biracial people, the vast numbers that you have today, 33.8 million, 10% of the populace compared to 1% in 1967, is because of civil rights legislation, and the most iconic figure of that is Dr. King. Do biracials owe Dr. King? They're out in these streets. All right, hold on here. Hold on here. I'm dropping the link. I want to know, what do you think? Do biracials owe Dr. King? 1967, 1% of you existed in the U.S. Today is 10%, 33.8 million, a 276 increase over 2010. That came from activism. That came from a religious centering. That came from a small lawyer educated in South Africa who lives in apartheid, contributes to that in some regard, takes his academics and self-discipline and all other controversies associated with who he is to India and liberates a country based upon a strategy anchored in a Christ figure, the seminal representation of Christianity, and talks to the Christians about your legislation or lack thereof. The university I attended in SoCal had mulatto women all over the campus, some of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. All right. I would say King is the most important figure in modern times. He's an important figure in the fight for an improvement of civil rights along a continuum. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. As I said at the onset, he is a seminal representation, right? Dr. King, is anchored in civil rights legislation. He is more profound and prolific and has more breadth than that. He eventually falls out of favor with the civil rights community and executive levels of folks because he begins to then challenge America essentially on the Vietnam War and poverty. He later on in life espouses social democratic ideology, and he falls out of favor. King is not anywhere as near popular as he was in 1964, where he was named Time Magazine Man of the Year. By the time he was assassinated April 4th, 1968, he was largely out of favor with most of political and civil rights leaders because they felt he was moving beyond his lane. But as Dr. King says in multiple sermons, his lane is where injustice exists, and that does not, he's not a consensus seeker. He is an equal rights, a social justice, an expectation that all human beings, not just by race or religion or denomination, all human beings deserve freedoms, liberties, and the right to exist, not because of any quality, credential, or qualification, but simply because they were born. When King talks about all God's children, in fact, on most Sundays, when you hear a preacher say all God's children, he's typically talking about the membership that's in the church, their children, the denomination children. King literally had a worldview that didn't see the I, it. He saw I, thou, I, it being my congregation, my denomination, my race, my sexual orientation, my this. He saw the 7.7, now 8 billion human beings, and he thought in relationship to how they existed. And that's why he talks about the interconnectedness. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are all tied together. He was speaking for that from a human perspective that transcended the United States and transcended onto the world. And this is how he viewed it. And he took the example of the Christ figure to shape that orientation and then dropped it down into a localized level in Montgomery, in Birmingham, in Detroit, in DC. And out of that comes this legislation that biracial children en masse are the products of because your mama and daddy were interacting, engaging, and socializing in ways that they could not prior to the civil rights legislation. All right. That's kind of what I wanted to share with y'all today. I'm reading up on MLK views on interracial marriage, and it appears he was supportive of it. Not just that, MLK had a relationship with white women by the name of Betty Moyes, but they couldn't marry. Yeah, that's an example. One of his sweethearts in college is the daughter, I believe, of, I may be wrong on this, but I believe it's a cafeteria, the director of the cafeteria, his or her daughter. Dr. King has a romantic relationship with this person while in Boston College, I believe. But then he asked the question, can I marry this person and still be true to what I'm trying to accomplish in the segregation space? There are countless interracial couples today who are working in activists and social justice so-called spaces, and they can do it because it's been two generations later. But could you imagine the political backlash, the lack of acceptance from his own community? That if he walked in there with his white love source and was then also talking about, what's going on in segregated America, he made a choice and he left love on the table so he could pursue essentially what became civil rights legislation. King is an example of many, many biracial kids who were not born because either the black dad or the white mom or whatever the relationship is chose not to continue it. They left love on the table so that they could pursue a life of minimal stress, or in the case of Dr. King, he knew it would be contrary to what he was trying to accomplish. Dr. King was certainly in favor of interracial marriage because he sees people as humans, humans that come from a birth story, courting rituals, cry, fear, laughter, joy, insecurities, angst, self doubt. He assigned all that is human to all humans and did not relegate that to a hierarchy of racial consideration. That was what white folks were doing at the time. King did not identify humanness with ideology. His credential for you having value is that you were born, not by your degree, not by your attire, not by your economics, not by your money. He was a forward thinker beyond his time. I believe in a century from now, he'll be saint like. But anchored in that, what you see today and what we take so casually was not possible on mass without serious stress and suffering. My parents experienced serious stress and suffering. What we're experiencing today is something we may take casual and feel is just, normalized, was not normal. In fact, you are the second iteration of that in terms of declaring and asserting a biracialness. But you declare biracialness that comes from generational work. Dr. King had a particular work. Our parents had a particular work, my generation, and now you have a particular interpretation and work associated with it. But biracial birth is connected to legislation. Mulatto brother, how you been, man?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, yeah. What do you think about today's topic?
Perfect. Yeah, I wanted to get into that, but firstly, I just wanted to congratulate you and your beautiful family on the
Hey.
marriage, and then also the time you got, for you personally, the time you spent on vacation, and then
Mm-hmm.
also for your sons for the college graduation. So congratulations to all of you.
Mulatto, I truly appreciate that. And you of all people need to get you a Puerto Rico trip in, brother.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking Brazil in a few months. I'm trying to arrange some things
Mm-hmm.
about that, but yeah, for sure.
Well, beautiful, man. Thank you for those congratulations and well wishes. And then also for kind of reaching out, saying where you're doing. And I look forward to us connecting next week, I think it is, right?
Yeah, most definitely. We're going to have a stream talking about the growth trajectory, your criteria you've developed. So I'm very intrigued by it, and it's a blessing to have you here making content on in the YouTube space. Because definitely, I'm a couple decades younger than you.
Right.
Our younger generation, we're looking for solutions. We're looking for answers. A lot of us are kind of lost out here, so to speak. I wouldn't say I'm specifically lost. I
Mm-hmm.
do have a general direction, but I think having some kind of guidance and structure from people who, like yourself, who have more experience, who have lived a life, I think it's extremely helpful. And of course, I can do the same for in a positive way for people that are younger than me.
Mm-hmm.
Just connecting the dots between the different generations, I think, is extremely helpful.
No, absolutely. It's going to take multiple generations. In fact, history will do that anyway, right? I think if we don't keep Dr. King out there, it's a national holiday, so it'll be out there in perpetuity, assuming. But eventually, it'll just more and more details, nuances will get lost just as time goes by, right? So the same, and then people live in their reality, and they don't owe any debt of understand of interpretation. They should seek to understand the past, but the most premium priority is the now, right? And so, I'm using this as a way of saying, hey, biracial birth has come as the output of legislation influenced by King, and that's good historical information. But your future, what your children become mulatto is directly related to what your crew, your community, your generation is doing, right? And it's important to lean on the older generation for some insight and perspective. But at the end of the day, you gather, you collect, you give deference as appropriate for those who are deserving of it. But you then have to have a boldness like Dr. King did, where he pulled from the past, from history, to address a modern era, speaking in familiar touch points to the audience in front of them, right?
Yeah, most definitely. I think him with his religious background definitely played a major role in kind of connecting the dots or making a connection with the kind of greater white society, playing on the sympathies with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think things could be a little different today. There's that generational nuance because there's a lot of different belief systems today, and that the society. I don't know. It's strange for me to how to interpret this, but there's so many different philosophies that are out there today. It's not all just a Christian nation, like right, like
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
was in the '60s,
Mm-hmm.
and here we are in 2023. We have a lot of different philosophies. So connecting our people, our group to the plight moving forward. It's going to be an interconnected society, right? The whole segregationist kind of ideology with the
Mm-hmm.
internet, with mass transportations, airports, etc. Um, it's gonna be more difficult for people to want to have their own group and be closed off, etc. Even if you look at like Amish people, there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of there's a lot of documentaries and a lot of people that are basically examining them and their way of life, like promoting it to the media. So what I'm saying is closed off societies and segregation is not really idealistic. So we're going to be the groups are going to intermingle with each other ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
I said a whole lot there. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's a different time today, right?
Right, right. But as you are continuing to advocate and assert a mulatto-ness outwardly, you're going to have all kinds of pushbacks, all kinds of counter arguments. But I think it's helpful for those who want to take on any particular lane is you're connecting mulatto history to American history, and it's very interesting that the numbers in the U.S. This isn't the trajectory in other kind of countries, but biracial was very small, for a period of time, and it was very geographically concentrated in pockets of the South historically.
Hmm.
But today we talk about the growth, right? And there's reasons for that. You talk about the increased visibility of biracial presenting kids, mulatto presenting kids in all sectors of life, but there's a cause for that, and the cause of that is America had a turning point. It was for economic reasons. It was young people who were, willing to challenge old protocols and stereotypes. But where you are today is directly connected to seminal acts historically, seminal milestones. And as much as you are claiming and asserting a legitimacy and identity, it's helpful in the community that there are historians, that there are storytellers, that there are folks who can connect their presence, their legitimacy, their self assertion to historical context. And so today was a way of spinning off Dr. King on his birth day, rather, the 15th. And as someone who has high cachet and name recognition across the world, but particularly here in the United States of America, how can the narrative and the work of Dr. King have relevancy in what you guys are trying to accomplish as a mulatto community, which is essentially to transcend commonality and community and then to enter into culture? But you're doing it with only the past to look at. You have no future projection or example of a culture within a culture attempting to assert itself as new. That's a dynamic thing.
Yeah, yeah, it's complex. It's extremely complex. I mean, what I can say is for sure is to like answer your question, do biracials owe big to Dr. King? I mean, I kind of would agree with the gentleman in the chat, Thunder, who's saying no, we don't, in a sense. But then I do see your point as if yes, we do, because he was not only a civil rights advocate, he advocated for pretty much all of Americans, so to speak, and obviously his religion was definitely what tied him, his belief system, to have that type of stance. But do we owe him? It's very strong words.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Of owing. My whole thing is like for my tomorrow, I'm gonna have a stream, and basically, the question or the word that I'm promoting is reciprocity, right?
Mm, mm,
Typically, it's like a trade off, a fair trade off, or a quid pro quo. Essentially, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. So
mm-hmm,
this being owing someone is being in debt, and it
mm,
seems like there's this relationship where biracial people, mulatto people, because of this like mind kind of this theory that they have this privilege, they have this light skin privilege and proximity to whiteness, therefore they owe the black community, they're
mm,
indebted to the black community to prove their blackness, they owe them, they have to serve them and uplift them in order to get acceptance into the black community. So I definitely push back against that because I see things a lot differently this generation. But
mm-hmm,
as far as Dr. King, I've always held him in high regard. I've always respected Dr. King. I was definitely more of a Malcolm X guy. I could just publicly say, like
mm-hmm.
looking at like Black history when I was 16, 17 when I first started. So this was like 2005, right? Because I'm
Right, right.
still kind of younger. So, but Malcolm X was kind of the guy that I looked at for references and stuff, but I've always respected and had and held regard Dr. King, but I don't know if I can respect him, his legacy and what he's done, but to
Mm-hmm,
say that I owe him anything, I think that would be a whole question for all of America. I don't know specifically biracial people because we're part of both cultures of the
mm-hmm,
European and the African. Talking about
mm-hmm.
mulatto biracials, but yeah.
So what would be a more acceptable phraseology from your perspective? Does what was the word again? Do do biracials blank big Dr. King or
Well, I
do
mean, it's
bi
your yeah, it's your question, right? Your
right,
your
right.
your philosophies and stuff. I'm not interjecting any of my thoughts. I'm just saying, like, for me, the word that I am going to stress is reciprocity,
Mm-hmm,
because the thing is, I feel like owing it's a big word to feel like that do biracial people owe, like just for our existence, basically, oh, because he fought for integration so that black people and white people could come to get commingle,
mm-hmm.
but black and white people have been commingling together across the board and around the world, right? And Caribbean, and obviously it was illegal with the miscegenation laws in America.
Right.
I don't know. I just the thing with owing.
Do in that statement, are you then connecting Dr. King to blackness, even though I've attempted to articulate it as a seminal figure? Because is the ode to the work of a human being, or is it too blended and blurred with blackness, and then ode to blackness, and then that's contrary to kind of
Yeah,
the this yeah. That's a,
sovereignty for mulatto. Yeah, because
yeah.
the thing is, though, could you name me one white figure that we could publicly say that we owe it to them for our existence being here, like George Washington, Abraham
Yeah,
Lincoln,
yeah,
etc.? We don't
yeah.
really pose that question. That
You
there's
know,
an
you're right. You're right. There's a cultural there's a cultural self licensing within Black rhetoric and conversation, right? That would you do that with another community? Because in theory, if you want to parse hairs, it could be LBJ because he's the one that signed the thing, right? He's the one that
Mhm.
put his he also risked his political future. He was still elected, but only did one term, right?
Right.
So obviously it told on him. So you're right. Um, that there's other names that could be asserted there. The dynamics of Dr. King, as I'm attempting to contextualize it within a biracial relevancy, is the element of proximity. and that America, its proximity to each other was typically power based, hierarchical, or one advantage to the disadvantage of another. It's these incremental steps and the emergence of legality or protection under federal executive order that goes from rigid racialized segregation to an increasingly engaging, interacting, relating, dating kind of reality across races, of which the modern era is manifesting itself in the growth. That was an historical moment in history that gives number volume to biracial people today, if that makes sense. And that unto itself is sort of the session's sort of musings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. Um, and then of course what he put here, yeah, the
There,
lovings, yeah.
right. There is a white figure, the Lovings, right? Absolutely, absolutely. Mulatto, I have Thunder in the back. Do you want to stay on or you want to
I'll
listen?
step down. I basically just want to congratulate you, and then just kind of just mention the whole part about owing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Owing is kind of the thing that I think I personally don't think we really owe Dr. King. Just to answer the question, I think we should respectfully, pay respects and homage to him. I've always been paying respect, but I don't feel like I owe, um, the black community, and because Dr. King is essentially the figure representative
Mm-hmm.
for the black community, I don't feel like I owe the
Mm.
black community anything, because in today's generation, I'll just before I drop off, I'll say we're not being protected. We're not being brought into the group. We're being pushed out and out grouped. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're at a point now, a crossroads, where we have to create our own group, and we have to hold up and honor those of us who speak for us and advocate for us, our own heroes. But we can pay respect to those um, from generations before us that did good things. I just leave it at that. Thank you for letting me up.
Boom. That was a hell of a way to round it out. Respect for historical figures that did work, but to stand in one's own sense of agency, right? And to be very mindful of words and sort of power dynamics that play themselves out. Respect for that. Thunder, how are you? How's it going?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing very well, brother. Musing on a Sunday, Dr. King Day, hero of mine. How about yourself? Do you have a channel, Thunder?
No, I don't have a channel. I've thought about talking and doing a channel, and I still might. I enjoy coming up on other people's streams and participating. So, and I like
well,
your delivery. I like your style.
thank you, brother. I appreciate that. I asked because I wanted to. I always like to shout out other channels. We're all just new and merging and trying to grow in the space, and so love for each other is important. I think at this phase. But
Yeah, there
Thunder,
are a
what?
lot of possibilities I
Mm-hmm.
see on YouTube, and I'm torn between talking about this subject that Mulatto Vanguard and uh, others talk about,
Mm-hmm.
and health,
Mm.
um, because I've always thought health is very important. So I'm torn between directions to go. But, you know, I'm not going to dispute anything that you've said about Dr. King. I think all of it's correct and relevant. When I saw the title,
Mm-hmm.
I was a little bit taken aback.
Did it get you in? Did it get you in?
Oh, it
My
got me in.
okay, my thumbnail clip bait, whatever they call it.
It
I
reeled
got you
me
in,
in for sure. Um, but the reason I said no for me specifically is this: my great grandfather was a colonel in the Civil War in South Carolina.
Mm,
He was a judge, a mayor of his town, and then his son became a judge and mayor of the same town. Very small town,
okay.
but it was his son, born in the 1840s,
Mm-hmm.
that came together with my grandmother,
Okay.
mixed African and Cherokee woman,
Beautiful.
and created that union. And that union was uh, not contested in that small town of South Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
partly because of the power of my great grandfather.
Right.
Nobody was going to contest him. Um, So that was the first union on my father's side.
Was
I've
it
said,
supported by the family?
I'm sorry,
Was it supported by the family?
by his family.
Yeah.
You know, I hearing what happened after he died, I would have to say no, not totally, but one of my great aunts did stay in communication with her white family members,
Okay.
but all of the property was taken from us.
Right. Right.
Um, but the other thing that he made sure of, and so we like to tell this story amongst family members, is my grandfather, born in the 1880s,
Mm-hmm.
was an AME minister who had been educated in one of the HBCUs in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
Actually had to go to him. Actually had to go to this Scottish dude, as we would say, and
Right.
ask for the hand of his daughter.
Mm.
And so that's highly unique and unusual at that time. Now we're talking the early 1900s, because my grandmother was born in 1892. So
Okay.
now we're getting into the 19 early 1900s.
Wow. And that was the first relationship where interracial dating in your family tree that you traced.
The first was my great grandfather, who was
Okay.
born in the I have to pull it up, but 1840s. And
And and
he
and and Thunder, sorry to interrupt, but this is fascinating. Does was the mom in enslavement at the time?
we don't know.
Okay. Okay. Appreciate that.
We don't know. I can tell you that he this was his second. Uh, he couldn't marry her because it was illegal,
Right.
but this was his second union, and he forced his first wife to leave that town and move to Atlanta
Mm.
because this was his family now.
Right.
So I have a picture in the late in the 1800s where
Mm-hmm.
our he had created a black school, and two of his sons had shotguns, one in the front, one in the back. All it
Right.
was a schoolhouse. It was just
Right.
very small, and there
Right.
was only maybe 20 some students in there.
Mm-hmm.
But he directed his sons, if anybody comes up here and tries to prevent them from getting educated, and it was a
Mm-hmm.
black teacher, it was an African American woman teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, "Shoot them,
Shoot on sight.
shoot them." Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, and I have a similar story with respect to my mother's side, which was right across the Savannah River, and it was, that was also a union. I mean, so it wasn't a forced union over there either.
Okay.
Um, that takes us a little bit far field from whether, uh, and I guess maybe it doesn't, whether MLK, whether we owe something to
Because you
biracial
existed before
people.
him, right? Because you existed before him. Yeah.
Yeah, and there were a lot of families like that, but in the scheme of things, in the percentage wise, it was very minute, right?
Right.
But you saw me talk about the AME Church
Mm-hmm.
and what the AME Church did, and the AME Church actually started in the early
In Charlotte, right?
1800s,
In
right?
Charlotte, right? Mm-hmm.
And they were pivotal in pushing civil rights.
And could
And
you
then the
could
other thing for me, having grown up in the North and
mm-hmm.
having family members that were educated, as I said, my grandmother went to college, and she was born in 1892, and my grandfather had gone to an AME. Uh, I don't know if it was a religious school or not, but they both went to HBCUs in South Carolina.
Yeah, let me
Um,
interject here, Thunder, just a little bit, just to give some context and build some flavor into what you're sharing. The the And I just lost my train of thought. Oh, AME, to have African Methodist Episcopal in your name in the 18th, late 18th, early 19th century, that is a bold act of cultural courage to put it in your name, right? To center it in a continent of origin. I always thought that was a profound thing, and I was sort of shocked as to when it was established, there in the heart of the South and the Carolinas, but to put African Methodist in the name, I mean, that was beautiful. My daughter goes to school in South Carolina, and we went to Charlotte and saw the original church, and you almost have to get sort of an ancestral head nod to the community of people who have that kind of self identity declaration. And yes,
Right.
most HBCUs were founded by religious institutions
Right.
as a way of creating teachers essentially for recently
Hmm.
freed Africans, and they were the benefactors of that. If you look at most names of colleges, they're founded after white male benefactors who play
Exactly.
prominent roles in particularly Methodist churches. Just an
Hmm.
aside there.
No doubt. I have an interesting story about my grandfather and how we wound up in Detroit.
Okay.
He shot a man's dog, and they were going to
Yeah,
hang him.
yeah, to leave at midnight, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
And it was his Scottish father-in-law that said, "I can't protect you anymore. You
Mm-hmm.
need to take my daughter and leave."
Mm-hmm. You,
So
you,
that's how we wound up in Detroit.
yeah, most migration is thought of for work, right? But there are
Hmm.
countless stand tall black men and women, people of color, who just wasn't going to take that bullshit, and they retaliated. But then they had to get out of Dodge, right? I don't
Yeah.
know the data on that, but migration wasn't just for employment; it was for courage and self preservation.
That listen, he was a minister at a small church
Right.
in the town there, and because he shot a man's dog, and the way people feel about their
Mm-hmm.
dogs, they were going to
Mm-hmm.
string him up.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yes, I think that Martin Luther King m- modernly, and we haven't seen a figure of his stature since him.
Right.
And I was probably in the fourth grade when he died. I can remember when it came across the radio or the television that it was reported. I'm sitting in my elementary school class, and so I remember the time.
Wow.
Um, I think sometimes though that uh, we as African Americans and biracial people, um, we hang on to an event, and it seems like we're waiting for the second coming of something
Mm-hmm.
instead of really pushing forward and building
Mm.
upon some of the things that Martin Luther King himself built on.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's being done, and it's just not. Maybe we're past that civil rights point where we get these figures. There are no more figures anymore. It's just
Yeah. Personality leaders.
right, and we're
Personality
learning.
models. Yeah.
I think we're learning now as a country we're maturing
Mm-hmm.
as a country,
Mm-hmm.
and we've hit this stumbling block right now with I think the racism that's going on, this that was introduced by the previous president.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the
Trump.
Yeah, there was
Mm-hmm.
there he introduced a sense in this country that I think the country needs to grow and understand and get past. We've
Mm-hmm.
never dealt with it. It hasn't been dealt with. And I think
The
that
internalization of racism or
yes,
the okay, yeah, yeah.
yes. Um, and I think it's a growth point in the maturation of this country, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like I have to be honest with you. I feel like Mulatto Vanguard and the future is golden, and a lot of the other people that are on here that, we're searching for yourself, we're searching for to create
Mm-hmm.
a path where we are recognized as ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a part of the growth you're talking about, the
Right.
evolution, the evolving. I'm born 68. If
Hmm.
you were, you're slightly older if you were in fourth grade when King passed.
Right.
I military environment, my I was always biracial. I acknowledge a biraciality. My mom's from France, my dad's a Creole cat out of New Orleans.
Hmm.
But I pathwayed into blackness, particularly at college. Black frat, black
What
organizations, black
frat?
causes, Alpha Phi Alpha.
Yeah, all my father and uncles are alphas.
Yeah, yeah. And so in the early mid '80s, a lot of your question of who are you, and it was asked often in locally popular culture, movies, the music, and the question was then followed by what are you doing on behalf of cultural uplift, and so it
Right.
gave me identity, it gave me strategy, but again, it was a small percentage of people. The volume that we have now. And in my generation, we suppressed our white mothers' voices. We didn't exalt them in public. We kind of
Right.
exalted our fathers. And my dad was there. He's a high role model figure for me. But today, the numbers are different. The issues are different. And I believe the most beautiful thing that I see is the biracial mulatto community today are refusing to not acknowledge both their love sources. To me, that is wonderful, that is critically important, and increasingly they're butting heads, in physical streets, but in these social media streets about membership and gatekeeping. And at some point, they're just going to reject that, although they can acknowledge, as Mulatto talked about, a certain respect for people who did significant work, but their realities are different, and they're pushing back and asserting in different kind of ways, and those ways are unfamiliar perhaps to you and I generation. It's not personality based. There'll be charismatic personal kind of figures, but the dynamics of leveraging a religious arm to address legislation for political change. I mean, what other racialized laws are there en masse that impact the totality of society based upon color? it's
Yeah.
it's it's, it's localized now, and it's intra kind of dynamic. So their pathway into a culture will be arduous, will be difficult. I don't know if it'll have a similar glue to Chicano culture, black culture, Puerto Rican culture, whatever the case may be. But it doesn't seem to be a passing phase. I see momentum. I see multiple voices, intergenerational, and I think it's a beautiful thing. I don't think, maybe King thought about this when he talked about the beloved community, which essentially was a world where people acknowledged and loved what their unique identities were, but at any given moment they could transcend it for a greater human commonality. I think mulatto and biracial folks are they're attempting to be a part of that in meaningful ways.
What I agree. I mean, I think you said it well, and I think that what I am seeing, and it's only in this narrow sector of
Hmm.
some of these YouTube people,
Hmm.
um, is that they're arguing over terminology, over how to be called, and um, once that is settled, once that's settled, I think that they should really team up a little bit more. I find it kind of un unnecessary in a way to disagree with someone because they don't like a term.
Yeah.
They may not like mulatto. They may not like biracial. They may not like multiracial.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're really splitting hairs on that because, as I explained to you, there's no way that somebody like me, whose family goes back interracially 200 years,
Hmm.
that I don't know the nuances of the word mulatto,
Right.
right? because it was just
Right.
passed along, passed along, passed along.
Mm-hmm.
Um, however, I think everybody that is in this biracial, and I don't look at biracial as the current definition on YouTube as it's being used as the first generation of a parent, one white parent, one black parent. I think that's a new nuance in and
Mm-hmm.
of itself.
Mm-hmm. It
Um,
is.
but anybody who is mixed with black, white, Native American, but black and white mainly,
Mm-hmm.
uh, everybody has the same issues. I don't care if you're a first generation or a fifth generation. It you're going to experience. You're going to have similar experiences.
Right.
Um,
Right.
we may come at recognizing things at certain points in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And then, what I have seen having a daughter in this current generation that grew up in the suburbs, her interaction with being in an urban with a very large black community like me is
Mm-hmm.
totally different.
Oh yeah.
It's totally different. And the way she socializes is totally different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting. Speaking upon your French mother, my background is on my mother's side they're Huguenots.
Huguenots.
Yeah,
I'll
so
break
they're
that down.
from I guess that would be the southern part of France, but
Uh.
they immigrated here in 1703.
Okay. By way of Louisiana.
No, they came in. There were three brothers, so everybody with the Chenault name is supposedly related through these three brothers.
Okay.
They fought in the American Revolution.
Mm.
And when I speak about my Georgia uh, relationship, which is right across the Savannah River, because my family isn't but a few miles apart from South Carolina into Georgia.
Okay.
Um, he after the American Revolution, he went down to Georgia from Washington because this one particular great grandfather supposedly fought alongside George Washington. I mean,
Hmm.
actually fought alongside
Is
George
this your
Washington.
white side thunder?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Um, he wound up in Georgia, and that's my mother's. So she's a direct descendant uh, from his son,
Mm-hmm.
and then his progeny, and then my mother.
Man,
So
you
it's
all you got a whole lot of family history there, man. Shout out to your family historian if that's not yourself. But it's
it's
beautiful to be
it's
able to chronological back that far.
it's partly me, but my father was studied history in college
Mm-hmm.
and took that up a little as well. So, I just picked up where he kind of left off. I don't know if anybody's doing that after me, but kind of picked up where he left off, and I researched both sides of the family, especially since, you know, I think they're like 15 miles apart from South Carolina into Georgia.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it's not that hard when I would go down south to go from one state, one county, one city to the next to try to
Mm-hmm.
research all of these uh, these things.
No,
So,
beautiful.
but it's I'm going to a Martin Luther King event tomorrow.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll ask them the question. Do biracials owe big to Dr. King? No, Thunder, I really want to appreciate you coming up, and I
All
certainly
right.
will give the last words to you, or if there's any questions you might have. But to your point, as you're observing, the folks who are in the mulatto spaces, I consider it a social anthropological experience where I'm having the blessing of observing an attempt of self-declaration by a people who don't necessarily share common cultural history, but common identity history. And it's fascinating, right? As I talk to some of them about, the first phase is angry and irritation with a maternal Black cultural home of generations. There's a transitioning away from that, or there's a 1 foot in, 1 foot out dynamic, and then there's some internal bickering and angst that's associated with that. And so I see the name designation as an attempt to go into something more practical, right?
Right.
Some of them are sort of getting frustrated or weary with the beefing, and now they're
Right.
looking to be more productive. And then I'm beginning to hear more voices around addressing legislation. The census is a space for that. Discrimination crimes or hate crimes are associated with that. So it's not a very speedy process, but when in history has cultural formation been speedy, right?
Never.
So, do you have any questions for me, or King related, or
No, I
last
just,
thought?
you know what? I mean, I came across your channel a while back, and I don't, I'm, how sometimes you're looking at a channel, then your feed suggests
Yeah, yeah.
simply because you're in that space.
Hmm.
So, no, I really appreciate your evenness, your delivery, uh, your putting facts out there and not really trying to color the facts, but just
Hmm.
being objective about it. So I really just appreciate your objectivity and the way you deliver it, and your voice is really even kill and soothing. So continued success.
Thunder, I truly appreciate you. Mad respect for knowing your history that far back. And if you ever want to pop back on, man, feel free anytime.
Yep. Thank you very much.
All right, now take care. Beautiful family. Thank you guys for riding with me. I wanted to, stay within a biracial lane, but also honor a very prominent historical figure for me in my life and my identity formation, and somewhat of a worldview that I hope transcends, acknowledges, but transcends my individual life, my immediate family life, my cultural life, my national identity life, and this dynamic of being connected to the 8 billion resonates with me, and I must be quite frank and give recognition where recognition is due. That concept came from Dr. King's journey and countless tapes that I've listened to. If you really want to know Dr. King beyond I Have a Dream, which is a profound speech, he's written over 5 books. He has a collection of his sermons. There's a audio recording, or maybe it's on YouTube, called A Knock at Midnight, in which King captures probably 15 of his sermons. The brother is profound. The brother will give you chills with how he handles words, concepts, phraseology, putting things together. So if you are a Dr. King curious person, or if you just know him because his face is on a McDonald's plate or platter or piece of paper that you're putting your fries on, and you want to know one of our seminal historical figures, certainly not all, but if you want to know a seminal figure beyond just I Have a Dream speech and Black History Month tidbits, check out A Knock at Midnight, and be prepared to be in awe of the potential of humanity and the potential of that one particular human. On behalf of J4 Conversations, y'all, love, love, love. Thank you guys so much. Please share with a friend. Let them know about the channel. And if you haven't already, give us a subscribe and a like. Thank you guys so much. Peace, love.